The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
My hunch has been that he absolutely intends to run again. The amount of pushback from Liberal loyalists is considerable.
Then, later on The Agenda.
The clear, unequivocal positions he's taking, axe the tax, another example, are very strong because it means that if he gets a 4-year majority and he hasn't lived up to those very simple, clearly communicated slogans, Canadians should show him the door.
Also tonight.
More and more Canadians pay for their goods and services using plastic cards, their phones, or simply through an online profile. So, what's going to happen to coins as we head into an increasingly digital future?
The biggest question around Ottawa these days is, will Prime Minister Justin Trudeau hang around and fight a fourth consecutive election for his Liberals, or is his unpopularity so strong that he should consider resigning in the interim? Author and journalist Paul Wells has been giving that question and others some thought, and it's all chronicled in his new book. It's called Justin Trudeau, On the Ropes, Governing in Troubled Times. And we're here at the Ark Hotel, just a stone's throw from Parliament Hill, to have that conversation with Paul. Paul, it's great to see you again. How are you doing?
Good. It's always good to talk to you, Steve.
Pleasure. Your book starts out with what turned out to be a pretty hugely significant moment in the life of Justin Trudeau. So I want you to start by taking us back 14 years to that charity boxing match against Patrick Brazeau and the significance thereof.
So the thing that I take care to point out at the beginning was Trudeau did that boxing match because he had a lot of time on his hands. The Liberal caucus was the smallest it had ever been. They had come out of 3 of the 4 worst elections they've ever had. And yet, when it should have been all hands on deck, Bob Rae couldn't find much work for Justin Trudeau. He was a critic for amateur sport and post-secondary education. And so he was not needed in Parliament. He did a lot of charity events, and this was a charity event. And he had a hard time finding a Conservative who would fight him. When he found Patrick Brazeau in the Senate, a lot of people assumed the fight was already over. Brazeau is a physically very imposing guy, huge arms.
Martial artist.
Yeah, well, this is it, you know. I remember James Moore and Jason Kenney, the day of the fight, on Twitter, talking about what a tremendous victory was coming to their caucus mate, Pat Brazeau. They erased those tweets later. Trudeau beat him without much difficulty. I mean, Brazeau came on strong, and then Trudeau won basically through endurance. I wasn't there. I thought it was silly. I was surprised that friends of mine went. But it took on a life of its own. 9 weeks later, my interview with Trudeau was on the cover of Maclean's magazine saying maybe this guy should be the Liberal leader. I thought it was a saucy suggestion for me to make at the time. But it kept going, and by the end of that year, he was a candidate, and he eventually won quite easily. I would not belabor that stupid boxing match, except he does. He says to his friends, sometimes, not every day, you know, I've been counted out before. People have assumed I've lost before, and yet I came back, not just in the ring, but in 2015, 2019, and to some extent 2021. And that's why, at least when I wrote this book in February, he still liked his chances and thought it was at least worth the try to go up against Poilievre, his 4th consecutive Conservative leader.
You say it was worth the try. Are you not convinced that he still feels he can punch his way out from on the ropes?
So we don't chat, and I'm only guessing. My hunch has been that he absolutely intends to run again. The amount of pushback from Liberal loyalists is considerable. Now, they have no mechanism to make him leave. Or, I mean, if they were to try to make him leave, they would have to mount a concerted campaign of the kind that we saw Paul Martin run against Jean Chrétien. It's messy, it's fratricidal almost by definition. I see no sign of such an effort. He's a hard guy to predict. He's a hard guy to know. He makes it his business to be a hard guy to know. If he walked away, I wouldn't be too surprised. But if he wants to be a stubborn cuss, he can absolutely stay in that chair until we get a say as voters.
You've got him described in the book as saying that Canadians are big-hearted, fair-minded people. Do you think he still feels that way, given where he is in the popularity standings right now?
I think he thinks enough Canadians are fair-minded, big-hearted people. It's funny, his brand when he came into politics was that he loved all of Canada, even the parts that didn't like him. That was something they used to say to one another. But since 2019, 2020, especially since COVID, we have heard the odd distemperate remark from the Prime Minister to the effect that some people are extremist, or they've been duped by misinformation, or they're essentially they've skated themselves offside a proper political debate, and he's hoping that the rest of us can rationally choose to re-elect him.
So that line that we heard in 2015 about how conservatives are not our enemies, they're our friends, and we need to convince them to come with us, we're not going to hear much of that in the next few weeks.
We've been hearing less of it lately. It's funny, at the end of the whole convoy episode, I wrote a short book a year ago about the Freedom Convoy. Trudeau gave a news conference at the very end of that, after the Emergencies Act had been passed and the crowds had been dispersed, where he talked a little bit about this. If there's somebody that you disagree with on these questions, pick up the phone and call them. Not to debate this stuff, but just to check in. He is a complex guy, and I think he reminds himself sometimes that he's supposed to be a uniter. But as he has said out loud in some interviews, he finds it difficult.
This is admittedly a purely speculative question here, which will call for some informed speculation from you. But we well remember when he first got elected in 2015 that he sort of pledged to be the antidote to his father, who had become the great centralizer in terms of power in the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah.
And the gist was, I'm going to be the guy, the son of the guy who started this, who unwinds that and who gives ministers more power to run their departments, and it's not all going to be the cult of leadership around the leader. That clearly has not happened. Do you think if it had happened, if he'd kept his word on that, he might not be in the popularity pickle that he's in right now?
It's a good question. So if he had let ministers be ministers,
yes.
if he had let strong managers run files, I think he would say he didn't have the luxury of finding out, because when he came to office, he looked around, he didn't have strong ministers. He had strong personalities and strong intellects, people who'd done interesting things out in the real world. Jody Wilson-Raybould, Jane Philpott, Bill Morneau, Stéphane Dion. But with the exception of Dion on that list, none of them had done elected politics. None of them had been members of parliament before, let alone senior cabinet ministers. And so I think they found themselves on the back foot almost as soon as he formed a government. And, thinking of, well, let's pick Morneau, almost at random. Everyone likes Bill. Bill ran the largest HR firm in the country. Bill is urbane and so on. But Bill has never delivered a budget nor even taken a question in question period. So we're going to bubble wrap him and hope for the best. And that's why almost immediately this idea of cabinet government became a luxury they decided they couldn't afford.
I learned in your book that the PMO insisted no ministers meet with each other unless their chiefs of staff are present.
Yes.
Is that normal?
Not as far as I know, and as a matter of fact, it's slightly ridiculous. It amounted to a rule. This is Jody Wilson-Raybould writes about that in her memoir. It amounted to a rule that consenting as adults couldn't meet to talk about wine or the price of rice in China or whatever else without their minders present. And like a lot of the hardest and fastest rules in Ottawa, I suspect it was not presented to them as a rule, it was presented to them as a friendly suggestion. Like Stephen Harper's friendly suggestion that Conservatives shouldn't drink in bars where Liberals convened. And it was taken properly as an absolute iron rule if you cared about your future in politics. I think Jody Wilson-Raybould was increasingly puzzling to the Trudeau Centre because she kept acting as though her mandate letter meant stuff. And they kept, their highest principle was that if someone comes to visit you from the PMO, you should listen to them, which is different.
Does the Prime Minister's office appoint the chiefs of staffs of all the ministers?
There have been many cases, now there have been many cases, And sometimes the ministers get to pick their own, or their suggestions are retained. There are places where it's a long-standing routine that the central office, so in Quebec politics, where ministers have quite a bit of autonomy, they're also used to being informed of who their chiefs of staff will be. So
sounds like having a spy, like for the center, in your own office.
It's weird, I keep mentioning Morneau, it's just the way the conversation's going. Another minister said that Morneau said to them early on, you should try and identify one person in your office who you can absolutely trust, which suggests that you couldn't or even needn't be sure about the rest of them.
Okay. As we look back at Mr. Trudeau's record, it's not like he hasn't had any victories. And I note in your book, enhanced child care benefit, higher taxes on wealthier people, lower taxes for others, more generous pensions, legalized cannabis, improvements for Indigenous people, carbon tax and rebate, which whether you like it or you don't like it, it's a pretty ambitious policy.
Yep.
Protecting people and businesses from the worst of COVID-19. There are some successes to trumpet. So why isn't he more popular right now?
That's a good question. Incidentally, this book is, as you have noticed, quite critical of the Prime Minister. I worried before it came out that if there was a head of steam that built up of criticism of this book, it would be that I'm too easy on him, because the zeitgeist is done with the guy. And the book gives him a fair bit of benefit of the doubt. I was amazed by the reaction to the SNC-Lavalin affair, which I was very critical of the government. And the magazine I was working for, we ran a cover story that called him an imposter. But it was a very technical issue, kind of hard to wrap your head around, the autonomy of the Auditor General in prosecutorial decisions, or of the Attorney General. And yet they plummeted in the polls, and they have really never recovered. Well, what the hell was that about? And I think it was, my colleagues were very smart in picking that word, imposter. There's a sense of phoniness about the guy, and especially about his attempts to seem empathetic. When someone tells you that they feel your pain, but they don't hear what you just said, that's a problem. And it gets to be a big problem over a decade.
He is dramatic, right? When he speaks, he's dramatic. He has a breathiness about him in the way that he talks, which 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I guess compared to Stephen Harper, people thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
They don't feel that way anymore, I guess, eh?
It's funny, normally when we change heads of government, especially durably, especially over the ones who last a decade, they are very different from who they replaced. So whatever you could say about Mulroney, he wasn't technocratic and aloof. And whatever you could say about Chrétien, he took greater care to seem to be a man of the people than Mulroney had in the later innings. And Harper was tough, and he was delighted if people didn't like him, and he was not going to cut any slack to his critics. And that left a big opening for a kind of a Care Bear, and Trudeau was happy to play that role. And again, Poilievre. And incidentally, that's why there's a lot of talk in this town these days about Mark Carney as a potential Liberal successor. And my first instinct is to be very skeptical of that. But I'll tell you, Mark Carney is different from Pierre Poilievre in almost every way. And I think that would fit a long pattern, which is that if Poilievre were to be the next Prime Minister, he would likely be replaced by somebody who's nothing like him. And whatever else Carney may or may not be, he's nothing like Poilievre.
Right. But presumably Justin Trudeau these days is paying a higher price for some of the things that he didn't do. Should we make a bit of a list here of the things that he promised to do and didn't do, and therefore it adds to the fire of why people are unhappy with him?
Sure. I mean, the big thing is electoral reform. He is still, very recently in an interview with our colleague Justin Ling, still trying to come up with new explanations for why not only did he have to not implement that promise, but it wasn't even a big deal.
Because he said 9 years ago, this was the last first-past-the-post election this country will ever have.
Could not have been more categorical.
Right.
And then when he didn't deliver, it was he foisted it off on a new minister in the portfolio rather than taking it himself. The promise to plant 2 billion trees. The promise to make Canada the designer of a new age of urbanism in Asia. A lot of the things they have tried to do in the innovation economy. I mean, I'll stop there. When I get a good head of steam, I could go all day. But like I say, there's a bit of a paradox because, except for electoral reform, which I think was a real betrayal of a solid chunk of his electoral coalition, in isolation, none of the things he's failed to do or tried to do and fluffed seems enough to disqualify. And yet there has been a sort of a gestalt impression of the guy building up that doesn't help him.
The Liberal Party, as you and I both well recall, used to have a social justice wing and a business wing.
Yeah.
And they were sort of in dynamic contact with one another during cabinet meetings. They would hash it out and generally occupy the big center of the political spectrum and win a lot.
Yeah.
What is the status of the business wing of the Liberal Party today?
I think it's called Mark Carney. They finessed that for the longest time by persuading at least themselves that progressive politics was good for business, that green politics was good for prosperity, that feminism, diversity, reconciliation were all the ways to drive a strong economy. And that all looks a little threadbare now that we're in a period where the economy hasn't been strong. But, I mean, not only was that a handy little way to tie those things together, it was rigidly enforced from the center. No one was allowed to diverge from that line if they cared about their future. But more than that, it worked for quite a while. I mean, we're talking in June. I forget the date, but at some point in June, Trudeau will have been Prime Minister for longer than Louis Saint Laurent was. He's been Prime Minister for longer than Pearson and Diefenbaker. Why do people, why do lemmings follow the lead lemming? Because the lead lemming made it to the front of the pack and looks, until you get over the cliff, looks like he's doing pretty well. And so I think it's the same with Liberals.
Here's a quote from the book. He said, Canadians want, quote, a PM who never seeks to divide Canadians, but takes every single opportunity to bring us together. You want a Prime Minister who knows that if Canadians are to trust their government needs to trust Canadians. A PM who understands that openness and transparency means better, smarter decisions. In your judgment, has he lived up to his own words?
Many days he has. He has been more frequently available to people in my line of work than his predecessor was. He has, on occasion, I've taken questions as I talk to other people about this book about why he never apologizes. Well, he does apologize for his own behavior. He did in the blackface affair. He did when he strangely elbowed an NDP MP on the floor of the House of Commons. And I think they honestly believe that all of their various subsidies to old line news organizations are part of keeping the lungs of democracy healthy. I disagree quite starkly with that. But the instinct of any practitioner is to be defensive on some days. And the instinct of most communications advisors in the post-social media world is don't apologize, don't explain, barrel forward. You'll never persuade the people who disagree with you, so just keep hammering message. And a lot of the worst instincts of this government come from that, I think, flawed analysis of communications imperatives.
People who do what you and I do tend to, from time to time, overthink these things. And you mentioned Bob Rae earlier. Bob Rae once said, at a certain point, sometimes they just get sick of looking at your face.
Yes.
Do you think it's as simple as that?
Yeah, that's why I kind of checked my hanging judge instincts at every paragraph of this book, because I'm actually not sure that some perfect Prime Minister who took all of my advice would be more popular today after 9 years. Trudeau has people working for him now who worked for Kathleen Wynne at the end of her tenure in politics and one of the things they said at that time was, we're just not sure that you can sell the same product indefinitely, you know. The various stories that they tell themselves to justify or defeat. First of all, it might be that that government had done things that Ontarians didn't like. Secondly, it may be as simple as what Ray said. You know, I think Bob Ray has a pleasant face, but whatever.
You know this stuff as well as anybody. You know what task he is trying to achieve here, namely 4 straight election victories, which I don't think has been done since Wilfrid Laurier, and that's more than 100 years ago. So the odds are tall. What has to happen? Like, how do things have to unfold over the next year and a half in order to give him a shot at doing that?
Canadians would have to sour on the alternative, and they would have to get back to believing that there's a person in there when they look at the Prime Minister, and that it's somebody that they can trust, not necessarily somebody that they like. On the first thing, I mean, if you look at enough polls of perceptions of Pierre Poilievre, you find that he is quite a bit more popular and better liked than a lot of his coverage would seem to assume. But that there are things about him. He's seen as a tough guy. He's seen as a guy who doesn't always listen and so on. Could that, you know, blossom into opportunity for the Liberals over the medium term? Stranger things have happened. I mean, offhand, I can't think of any. As Trudeau knew in 2012, when it was just a boxing match, the on-the-ropes metaphor can only take you so far. Like, at some point, you actually have to be a competent fighter. You have to be better than evenly matched against your opponent. It's not magic. And this is a tougher confrontation. He won against Stephen Harper partly because the Harper government was seen to be worn out. And now he's in that place. It's a different dynamic.
So let's finish up here on a question of trust. To the best of my knowledge, most leaders who find themselves in this kind of pickle have a range of people that they can go to and say, so, what do you think? Have I got a shot, or should I take that walk in the snow, or what do I do? From what I know about this Prime Minister, he has the smallest circle of trusted advisors, maybe of any First Minister I've ever heard of. You're nodding your head, which makes me think I'm not wrong about that.
Yeah.
In which case, who's he talking to about whether to hang in there or whether to leave early?
So he is hearing from people who've been with him at least since 2012, 2013, people who would cheerfully walk into traffic for him, has been hearing from them for a while that it's not in his best interest to keep going. So the question is, does he listen? I believe his most trusted advisor is the one he sees in the mirror. And I don't know what that guy's telling him.
That's a very funny way to put it. Paul, it's great to see you. The book, we remind everybody, is called Justin Trudeau on the Ropes, Governing in Troubled Times, and we thank you for sitting down to take our questions today.
Thanks for the invitation.
He's been in first place in the polls for months, and all indications are he could be Canada's next Prime Minister. But how much do you really know about Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre? Well, that's a question broadcaster Andrew Lawton attempts to answer in his new book, simply entitled Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. And we're pleased that it's brought Andrew Lawton back to our studios tonight. Good to see you again.
And you, thanks for having me.
Okay, no one writes books about opposition leaders. You write books about prime ministers and presidents and that kind of thing. So why?
I think in an American context, it's actually quite common to have a book about someone before they achieve a particular role they're going for. And I think there's a logic to that. Canadians have a right to learn who these people are that are vying to be Prime Minister. I mean, Justin Trudeau was a much more well-known person in the Canadian consciousness when he became Prime Minister. And I thought with Pierre Poilievre, there was an opportunity there to really help tell that story of who he is and where he came from.
You are an unabashed conservative. He is an unabashed conservative. Should we infer from that that you're being a little too sweet on him in this book?
I think on television, you need to distinguish the small c from the big C there. Is that, certainly I have an ideological view of the world that I don't hide from, but I don't have a partisan loyalty. And I think that the book is fair and has actually, I noted Mark Miller tweeted approvingly an excerpt of it when it came out, the immigration minister. So the Liberals have found something in there they like. But also, I think the crucial point is that because of the connections I have in the conservative world in Canada, I was able to delve into his life and the people around him in a much better way than a lot of other journalists would have. And I think in that sense, even if people don't like my view of the world, they're going to have a much greater understanding of Pierre Poilievre because of that.
The easy version on Pierre Poilievre is that he's the Donald Trump of the North. How accurate do you think that is?
Not at all. And I think there are two problems there. One is that Donald Trump is such a disruptive figure in politics that it becomes an easy comparison for anything, where if you really look hard enough, you can always find some Trump comparison of anyone in politics. And I think it becomes fairly lazy when people do that as a political sport. But I also think that his experiences have been uniquely Canadian in a lot of ways. I think his influences coming from the Reform Party of Alberta of the 1990s, you can look at him as a modern Preston Manning far more than you could look at him as a Canadian Donald Trump.
Well, Donald Trump was raised by a multimillionaire land developer from Queens, New York. And Pierre Poilievre has the most interesting background, perhaps. Well, I was going to say of any prime minister. He's not prime minister yet, but certainly this guy has a very atypical background. You want to go into some of that?
Yes, and I'll say on this, Canadians have heard the very brief snapshot that he gives in his speeches. The adopted son of two school teachers from Calgary, born to an unwed teenage mother. So people have heard that. And I think there's a lot more complexity there. And we heard glimpses of it from him in some speeches over time. His parents were affected by high interest rates and had to downsize their home. He actually went through a process with his brother to reach out and build a relationship with their biological mother and her family later on in life. And they were certainly interesting. And I think in that way, when he says it's a crazy mixed up family, there's some truth to that.
Yeah. But just for those who don't know, his parents' marriage ended when he was 12 years old. His father ended up with another man. There doesn't appear to be, at least I didn't read any in your book, this sort of, oh my God, this is so embarrassing and going to ruin my life in Alberta of the 1990s. Why not?
I should say first and foremost that I would have liked if I had had a bit more access to Pierre Poilievre himself, who didn't do an interview for the book. I would have loved to have tried to get a bit more about that, about how this affected you in your life and how you did. But people around him said it was never an issue, that, sure, the divorce may have had the issues you'd expect of a child of, I think, around 12 years old, but his father coming out as gay was not something that he really had an issue with. He's always had a positive relationship with his father and his father's partner, with whom he still is, and who was actually at the leadership announcement when Pierre Poilievre won in 2022. So it was never an issue from what I gleaned from talking to those around him that caused him much in the way of grief, if any, when he was younger.
Because you can imagine he might have had a tough, you put that on the list of difficult things, parents divorcing, father ending up with another man. That's all, fairly unusual stuff for most people to have to deal with. I don't think I'm being unkind when I say he was not exactly Hercules growing up. He was kind of a goofy-looking kid, in some respects. Any of that all add up to making his childhood more difficult than it needed to be?
Well, he was into athletics. He was actually quite the wrestler.
Yeah.
He was the wrestler, and so much so that his father had built one year a wrestling ring in I think it was their front yard, because that was obviously something that Pierre and his friends really liked doing. I also think that when you look at his involvement in politics, he very much had that bookishness and that nerdiness. Like, I did get some questions to his mother and asked, about his favorite books, and the answer she gave was the dictionary. So I don't know if it had much of a plot, but that was what he was reading. And Milton Friedman's tome, Capitalism and Freedom. So he wasn't immersing himself in the same things that a lot of his colleagues in high school in Calgary would have been.
How did he get mixed up in Reform Party politics?
It was his mother, and it was that wrestling and an injury that he had, tendinitis, that had him basically bored. And he started tagging along with his mother to political events. She was involved in some pro-life circles in the Alberta PC party and ultimately in the federal Reform Party. And he started going to these riding association meetings. And he tried to get a seat on the Riding Association for Preston Manning's Reform Board in Calgary Southwest. And at the time he was 14, they didn't really have a place for him, but they didn't want to show him the door. So they said, well, why don't you come out and do some phone banking? And he went to this Reform phone bank, and Rob Anders, who later became a Conservative member of Parliament, was running this, and took Pierre in and just said he was a natural for this. He was getting credit card numbers, he was getting donations, he was just had this natural confidence on the phone. And I heard about that from someone else, a gentleman by the name of Jason Kenney, for whom Poilievre did some phone banking as well. And Kenney told a story that's in the book where he walks into this room and he doesn't see Poilievre, he hears him. He hears this voice that's doing all of this great work, this confident work on the phones, and he's picturing some lawyerly guy in his 30s. And then this scrawny teenager comes out and says, "Hi, I'm Pierre Poilievre."
Now, when you say his mother got him in, you mean his adoptive mother?
Yes, his adoptive mother, Marlene.
Does he have any kind of relationship with his birth mother?
He does. And it was actually his younger brother, Patrick, who they share a biological mother. And he was also adopted by Marlene and Donald Poilievre, the crazy mixed up family that Poilievre himself speaks about. It was Patrick that really, when they were in their late teens, wanted to build a relationship with their birth family. And they reached out to her and ended up forging quite a strong bond with her and also with her father. And he's passed away now, the grandfather. But the mother, she was at Pierre's leadership announcement in 2022.
Jacqueline Farrell.
Yes.
She was 16 when she had him. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, that's Alberta. How does he get to Ottawa?
So Reform politics became more Ottawa focused in the course of the 90s. So he had been involved. He went for the first time as an intern, and he was put in Jason Kenney's office and had his, really got to cut his teeth in a lot of ways there. And this was, of course, when he builds a relationship with Jenny Byrne, who he had known a little bit, but they became romantically involved when he was an intern in Ottawa. And of course, they moved back to Calgary, but then a job comes along with Stockwell Day, who was at the time an up-and-comer in Reform politics and Alliance politics. And at the time, he was the Reform or the Alliance critic for foreign affairs, but he was a member of Parliament, needed someone to help him out in his office. Pierre Poilievre took the job and moved to Ottawa and never looked back.
There you go. Let me pick up on the Jenny Byrne angle of this thing, because she's, of course, there again, running his operation in Ottawa right now. You've got a lot of detail in the book about how he pursued the woman who would become his wife. You've got a lot of detail in the book about the nature of the relationship he had with Jenny Byrne. Some of this is kind of personal stuff. Did you have any qualms about including that in the book?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier on when you asked about whether people would be concerned about a bias, and that I went in with the view that not every individual detail is going to be worthy of being put in the book, because you want to make sure things are verified and factual. But his personal life is a part of who he is as an individual and also who he is as a politician. I mean, these relationships that you mentioned are both people that have been hugely linked to his political career as well as his personal life. I mean, Jenny Byrne, he's had a relationship with her in some form for 25 years now. They've been romantically involved, yes, but she's also been his most senior advisor, his most trusted confidant. Anna, his wife now, the mother of his children, also is a huge part of his political identity. So telling the story of him without that, I feel, would have been missing a big part of who he is.
Here is, I mean, one of the things you say in the book is that to know Pierre Poilievre at 45 is to know the guy who at 20 wrote an essay saying, as Prime Minister, I would ... And let's do, Sheldon, top of page 3 here, let's do an excerpt from that essay that Pierre Poilievre wrote 25 years ago. He says, although we Canadians seldom recognize it, the most important guardian of our living standards is freedom. The freedom to earn a living and share the fruits of our labor with loved ones. The freedom to build personal prosperity through risk-taking and a strong work ethic. The freedom of thought and speech. The freedom to make personal choices and the collective freedom of citizens to affairs democratically. This is a 20-year-old University of Calgary student writing this kind of stuff. What do you make of that?
So funnily enough, I know the passage well, but because I read that essay many times over, but every time I see it, I'm always, wait, is that from 2022 or is that from 2000? There's that moment where, and there's another paragraph that's very similar to that is in his leadership announcement, the video when he launched his leadership bid more than 20 years later. And I think it shows, generally speaking, a profound consistency on the core worldview. Now, there are some little things that have changed over the years, but that core belief that freedom is the tide that raises all boats, that we need to get government out of the way, that societies are built by empowering individuals, that has remained unchanged for the entirety of his political career, but even before that, his early involvement, his early interest in politics.
Not all of his views have remained unchanged, and he is not going to like you for pointing out what I'm about to read next.
I know where you're going with
You
this
do
one,
know.
yes.
Bottom of page 3. Let's go, Sheldon. Here's Pierre Poilievre writing 25 years ago in that essay. I would resign after serving my second term in office. Politics should not be a lifelong career, and elected officials should not be allowed to fix themselves in the halls of power as a nation. If they are permitted to do so, politicians will devote their time to finding ways to perpetuate their own power as opposed to building on the freedom of their country. Okay, he hasn't exactly lived by two and out, right? He's won 7 straight elections in his Eastern Ontario riding. So what happened to that promise?
And he's seeking an 8th. So it's funny because in some ways it's a bit of a gotcha, because here we are comparing him against this thing that he said when he was young. And I don't actually think it's this silver bullet that shows any major flaw in him as a person, but I think it shows how consuming politics can be. And I posit a theory in the book of when that changed for him and of why it changed. And the theory that I have is that when you think of what a term is, you think of a 4-year interval. You think you're going to get in, you're going to have 4 years, ideally be in government. And he was elected in 2004 in opposition in a minority situation. A year and a half later, he's back to the polls again for his second term. He serves
another
2
minority
terms.
government.
Another minority government. This time he's in. He gets a parliamentary secretary role, so he's clearly doing something. But what happens then is he served 2 terms, but hasn't really achieved anything. Even the Harper government hasn't really achieved what it wants to achieve. And then you do another one. And then you're...
Which is also a minority parliament.
Also a minority.
So
and then,
not the full 4 years.
And then by the time he gets a majority, it's 2011, he gets into cabinet at this point, but he's now become this, and this has become him, and this is the life that he knows. And the other theory came, and it's not really a theory, but an observation that came from someone who helped out on one of his first campaigns and said they had a conversation with him in which he had talked about wanting to be finance minister or prime minister in the future, but at the time he had envisioned leaving politics and coming back. It's happened before in Canada. The problem with doing that is that your seat will be filled by someone else. So if you do that, how do you come back in? And can you come back in and seamlessly reintegrate? So if he had this long ambition, I think there was a bit of a path dependency there that may have kept him around. But he certainly has said in the past that, you know, career politicians were a problem, and now he's become one.
He has really become the king of, if you like him, snappy slogans, memorable political zingers. If you don't like him, puerile, frat boy, juvenile stuff, you know, Axe the Tax and Kyoto Joe and Jurassic Clark and all these kinds of...
I think that one was my favorite, Jurassic Clark.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, it's very Donald Trump, if you don't mind my saying, you know.
But before Donald Trump, and that's the thing. I mean, he was doing this back in, you know, his 20s.
That's true. Here's, we're going to show some tape here. Here is Pierre Poilievre in Parliament on the eve of Justin Trudeau taking a trip to New York City on business for the government of Canada. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
Here we have 150,000 people on strike, the biggest federal strike in Canadian history. Canadians can't get their services. Meanwhile, their housing costs have doubled and crime is ravaging through our streets. And what is he going to do today? Well, start spreading the news. He's leaving today. He wants to be a part of it. New York, New York. Mr. Speaker.
Mind the honourable members, his singing is not allowed. Whether it's good or bad, it's not allowed.
He's not exactly Frank Sinatra when he's singing, but having said that, what's your view of all of those tactics?
I think they're working. And it's interesting, when I've been asked similar questions to that, it's hard to look at the poll numbers that he has and find fault in the strategy. I mean...
Well, working to do what?
Well, working to, first off, get his message out to Canadians directly. I mean, he started really harnessing the power of social media when he was finance critic. And this was in the Andrew Scheer Conservative Party. And Poilievre, who had been known to people who follow politics really closely, but I wouldn't say to Canadians at large, really started to build up a national brand and national profile. And I think he realized that you need to have these snappy slogans to get people's attention. So that's the analytical point of view. If you ask about my own personal opinion on it, I think there are two things here. There are people that do slogans and nicknames because that's all they are capable of. And there are people that do them because they've decided that this is a way to get the message out. And I think he fits into that second category. And people around him told me that when he comes out with a line like "axe the tax," which sounds flippant and simplistic, he has probably spent days or weeks coming up with how he's going to use that and if he's going to use it, and really trying to decide what the best way is to harness that. And that's where I think it's working, because he realizes that you can't get people to pay attention to some 60,000 word white paper on some policy. You have to get them to pick up something that's memorable. And in that sense, I think the slogans and catchphrases, even if people don't like them or say they don't like them, are yielding fruit for him.
One of the hallmarks of his leadership style is railing against the so-called gatekeepers and lobbyists whom he claims not to like, and whom he believes are looking out for themselves as opposed to average Canadians. How does he square that view with the fact that, and we've talked about her here, Jenny Byrne, I mean, his alter ego, his brain, if you like, I mean, she runs a lobbying company. She is a lobbyist. How does he square that circle?
I don't know what that has to do with gatekeepers, though.
Well, he had a line the other day where, not the other day, I guess it was a couple of months ago already, he's talking to a Bay Street audience, and he looks in the audience and says, "You're all a bunch of lobbyists, you're going to have no role at all with my government." And yet there she is right beside him. How is that consistent?
So I don't know if she does any lobbying at this point, but I think generally speaking, his view is that lobbyists have gotten an easy ride with the government. And I mean, if you're a lobbyist, much like a lawyer, your job is to represent your client. So I think you're going to exploit any sort of vulnerability or any path you have to getting what you're achieving. So I think he's saying, listen, if you have this role and you want to make something happen in my government, you've got to sell it to Canadians. So I think it would just make it very difficult for any lobbying clients that Jenny Byrne's firm may have, in the same way that it'll make it difficult for other lobbyists. But I think it's interesting how those lines, which again may offend the traditional conventional orthodoxy of how you do politics, but I actually think they sell to Canadians very well, who probably view lobbyists in not a particularly favorable way if they know what one is.
Look at Andrew, they sell great. I'm sure they, I'm sure you can get a rise out of the electorate saying these awful lobbyists are getting special access to you folks, and here are we, the normal people, and we don't get anything. But then if he gets in, is he going to walk the walk, or is he just talking the talk here? Because at the moment, he's just talking the talk.
But therein lies, I think, the crucial point of Poilievre. And this is where, if I write a sequel in 4 years, I would have to assess these things in a way that I can't now. He has not left himself a lot of wiggle room on his key promises. I mean, defund the CBC is a great example. That's a policy that right now has 3 words to it: defund the CBC. You can't really get away from that if you come out later and say, well, we're going to maybe tweak with the business model and formula. Like you've said what you're going to do. With the lobbying thing as well, it's a very clear measure that he's put out for what a lobbyist-Poilievre government relationship will be. So I think that the clear, unequivocal positions he's taking, axe the tax, another example, are very strong, because it means that if he gets a 4-year majority, and he hasn't lived up to those very simple, clearly communicated slogans, Canadians should show him the door.
Couple of minutes left. I want to ask you 2 more things. He's now 45 years old. He's been a member of Parliament for 20 years. Politics is all he's really ever done. Do you know whether he considers, or any of the people around him consider, the lack of variety in his background to be problematic?
I don't know if it's something that he internally grapples with. There was one moment in the book that was recounted to me where Joe Preston, who's a former Conservative member of Parliament, now the mayor of St. Thomas, Ontario, he was seatmates with Poilievre on the first day of their first term in 2004. And he had said that over the time he and Poilievre got to know each other, Poilievre had expressed a bit of, I don't know if insecurity is, it's my word, it's not Preston's word, but a bit of insecurity that he hadn't had any private sector experience. And he was asking Joe about things that he could do. And one of the things he did, partially with Joe Preston's advice, was start a little business on the side owning real estate and just to do something that wasn't government. So I think earlier on there was some realization that maybe I should have something else I could point to, whether that was for political reasons or his own personal edification, I don't know. For the people around him, I don't know if it matters, because I think they know Poilievre for who he is today, and they like that guy. They're invested in that. They're invested in his success. And I think that Poilievre often talks about his upbringing, because even though it is unique for reasons we discussed, it's something that does situate him far closer to the middle class than, say, Justin Trudeau's upbringing does.
Just finally, what important lessons did he learn watching Stephen Harper be Prime Minister that if he were ever to get the job, he would make sure not to do?
What I have gotten from people around Poilievre on this is that there was a frustration with the incrementalism that became really the source of some complaints from some Conservatives about the Stephen Harper government. And part of that was because of those minority governments we talked about. But if Poilievre comes out of the gate with a very strong majority, I think there's, to use an Ontario politics comparison, there's something we'll see that will look a lot closer to what we saw from Mike Harris, where a very ambitious first term, not wanting to squander that mandate.
Mike Harris used to say, there will not be one blade of grass not trod upon by some protester by the time I'm finished with the common sense revolution.
And he was right even 30 years later, I think.
He was right, and you think Pierre will govern the same way, if he does get that chance?
I think so, certainly in terms of the ambitiousness of the agenda and the speed at which he'll move, yes.
Gotcha. It's called Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. Andrew Lawton is our guest. Nice job. It's a really nice read.
Thank you,
book.
Steve.
Thanks, Andrew.
Cold, hard cash, or coins, something we don't seem to regularly find in our pockets every day. More and more Canadians pay for their goods and services using plastic cards, their phones, or simply through an online profile. So, what's going to happen to coins as we head into an increasingly digital future? The Royal Canadian Mint is where our coins are made, so we headed to our nation's capital to meet with its team to find out what role coins will play as we move our spending online. This is the President and CEO of the Mint, Marie Lemay.
Thank you so much for having us at the Royal Canadian Mint. I want to start off by asking, as the CEO, how do you think of coins?
I think coins have been, over the years, a stable, foundational part of humanity, actually. It's been the global language across countries, and we underestimate the importance and the value that coins bring. And there's a trust in that piece of metal. So that underpinning stability and confidence is something that in today's fast world and digital world, we can forget and take for granted.
How much do you think everyday Canadians know what the Mint does on a day-to-day?
Well, I think a lot of Canadians think that we print bills, but we don't. We actually work in the metal industry. So we do the coins. We really have two areas of business: circulation coins, so that's base metal coins, is the coins that we use to trade in commerce. So the Canadian circulation, and we also do foreign circulation coins for other countries. And then the second area of business is precious metals, where we do investment products in gold and silver, and we also do collector coins. And we also have a group that does metals, like some of the Governor General medals, Olympic medals at the time. So really, we are in the metal business.
Before we get into what will happen to coins in the future, we wanted to learn how coins are made now. The Mint has two locations, one in Ottawa and one in Winnipeg, and each provide different functions. In Winnipeg is where circulation coins are made. That's the coin we have in our pockets, the loose change.
There's on a daily basis about 2 billion coins that circulate in the country. And we recirculate through a system that we have, and in collaboration with our financial institution partners and the armored card carrier partners, we recirculate coins to the tune of 88%. So we only have to produce 12%. To be able to maintain that skill, expertise, and sovereignty in making coins, one of the things that we've done over the years is actually start bidding on contracts for other countries.
The Mint, over the years, has also made foreign circulation coins and blanks for more than 80 countries, including Barbados, Sri Lanka, and New Zealand.
And that represents 85% of what we do in Winnipeg. So we started looking at our business about 5 years ago and looking at the future, because obviously digital payment is increasing, and we thought, okay, where is the value in the work that the Mint does? So the production, obviously, the skills, the innovation, but the management of the coin system is extremely valuable for that efficiency, but also to make sure that there's no shortages. And you'll say, okay, if you're not using coins, why would there be shortages? You know, you have coins that are flowing every day, and we do the forecast, and we talk to the financial institution, talk to the armored car carrier, and we move coins around. Nobody knows. It's like plumbing, you know, it flows and everything's good. And then COVID happens. Everything shuts down. So coins are, I'll say, stuck in the system somewhere. And then one province opens up with one type of industry, and then another one opens up with another type of industries. How do you make sure it flows if you don't know where the coins are? So the beauty of our system is we do know where the coins are. So we were able to actually say, hey, over there, it's starting to open, there's a demand, there's less coins, we need to move coins around. So we were able to prevent shortages.
As Marie mentioned before, it's not just circulation coins that the Mint makes. It makes commemorative coins, medals, and even bars of gold and silver, and that all happens in the nation's capital, where precious metals are processed.
How do you get from a precious metal in the ground to a gold bar, for example?
We work very closely with our mining sector and our financial sector, because we are privileged in Canada to have some really, I'll say, good gold mines with a good ESG record, and there are 2 certified LBMA refiners in Canada. We're one of them for gold. What we do is we get what we call the doré from the mine, which is what comes out of the mine with initial melting and refining, comes to us, and then we refine it here in Ottawa, 2 floors under where we're sitting right now.
It's amazing.
And we turn that into gold. But not only do we turn it into gold, the beauty is we turn it into gold to a purity that we were the first to do what we called 5-9. So that's 99.999. What you'll see on the market is often 4 nines, but the purity of the 5-9, we're able to do that here in Ottawa.
Why is that important, having that standard?
So the Mint, the Canadian Mint, has been recognized for its innovation, for its leadership. So the purity of the gold shows the expertise and the capabilities and the skills. There's a number of security features that we've been able to embed so that when somebody buys a piece of gold from the Royal Canadian Mint, they know they're buying good gold, pure gold, secure gold. So it is an extremely important feature.
The Mint in Ottawa makes precious metal products, including bullion bars and coins and collector coins. It all starts here in the refinery, where gold and silver are processed and purified. This is Scott Ingham, the Director of Manufacturing at the Mint. He helps explain the process, start to finish, of how the Mint's gold make-believe bullion coins are made.
The process is relatively straightforward, but prior to this, there is a whole purification process to take, mined precious metal, mined gold, and to purify it to the 2, 3, 4, and even 5 nines purity, 99.9% pure.
We start off in the refinery, where molten purified gold is poured into bars that will be used in coin manufacturing or become pure gold investment bars. Gold destined for coin production is put through a process called continuous casting, where gold is melted in a furnace and then cast into large coils. The coils are then rolled out in a rolling mill into a coil of strip that is ready for blanking. The coil of strip is then fed into a blanking press where perfect circles are cut out. They are collected, weighed, and eventually struck into the coins in a coining press. All collector coins are inspected carefully by hand during the striking process. After seeing how much goes into making coins, the question remains, As we move toward an increasingly digital future, will coins become obsolete?
Depending who you are, you can look around you and say, oh, my kids don't have any cash, I don't use any cash, and then you think the world is all now cashless. It's not the case. Like I said, there's still 2 billion coins floating in the country. That's the demand right now. But when we do surveys, it's become very clear that first of all, there's a segment of the population that needs the coin. And what we found from our survey is 83% of Canadians say they are cash users. But out of those, a quarter say regular cash users. But those regular cash users are mostly people with lower income. They live in rural communities. We have some Indigenous people, recent immigrants. So there's a segment of the population that is heavy users of cash. There's this thing that I call the paradox, because when we ask Canadians, 3/4 say I have no plans of going cashless, even if they're using more and more e-payments. I think there's that aspect that even if you don't use it, you don't want to lose the option to use it. At the end of the day, we see that it's not going to be cashless, it's going to be cash light. And for the foreseeable future, there's going to be coexistence of both digital and physical currency. So it's really important to keep the infrastructure and the system working to be able to make sure that people that need to use coins can use them, have access to them. And if there is a reason why in a certain area we have to use it because there's a crisis, there's fires, systems are down, then we can use them.
How do you think the role of the mint will shift over time?
I really do think that we will continue to produce coins, obviously less and less, but the management of the coin system, even if we weren't producing any coins, you'd still have to manage the coins and make sure they're in the right area. The stats that I gave you about Canadians not wanting to go cashless and Canadians saying they still use cash, and a segment of the population needing to use cash, we really do need to continue to produce or make available coins where they are needed, when they are needed. And that's critical, and that's our role. So that's what all of our research, all of our planning is to make sure that we can continue to fulfill that and never have shortages.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
It is a deep-seated belief and a cardinal rule among everyone in the National Hockey League, Steve. If you play it or coach or on a team and your name is not on the Stanley Cup, you don't drink out of it, you don't touch it. Absolutely not.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.